As many of you may know, and for those who don't, I'm delighted to share with you that the Cantor is home to the Asian American Art Initiative that is co-directed by my amazing colleague, Elisa Alexander, who's, we are gonna do the brief Q&A tonight after Shahzia speaks. And she co-directs the initiative with Stanford art historian Marcy Kwan. And part of the work of the Asian American Art Initiative is to amplify the work of Asian artists of the Asian diaspora. So if you wander into Dwelling, into the collections show next door, you'll see real strength in artists of the Asian diaspora, but it's also about having convenings and really thinking about scholarship and introducing work to the next generation and to grad students here. So, you know, I remember shortly after I started, there was an incredible convening that Marcy organized, scholarly convening. And this is the second one we've had since then. We had one earlier today, a sort of group of wonderful scholars and musicians and composer who spoke about Shahzia's work and put it into context. And so I just want to take a moment to thank those folks who were part of the earlier part of the day. Sonia Ree Mace, curator at the Cleveland Museum, Padma Maitland, curator at the Asian Art Museum, and very importantly, a former curator here. Eugenie Tsai, longtime curator at the Brooklyn Museum. Just what incredible presentations you all shared with us. But Shahzia only got to speak for a little bit, so that's what we're here for tonight, is to hear her. And I just wanted to say, though, that this work is really done in collaboration and partnership, and I think the show actually has its origins in two Ohio museums collaborating. The Cleveland Museum and the Cincinnati Museum organized the show that's on view in our second floor galleries. And we just feel, that they made our show here possible. And I also just wanted to add a little personal note that it has been personally very meaningful to have Shahzia's show here as well. I first saw Shahzia's work in the late 1990s, right after I graduated from college and moved to New York. And I was lucky enough to land a job as a curatorial assistant at the Whitney Museum of American Art working for Eugenie Tsai, who spoke earlier today. And she introduced me to Shahzia's work and the work of so many great artists. And I knew at the time how lucky I was to have Eugenie as a boss, because she's also just an awesome human being and great person. But all of these years later, I have such a deeper appreciation for what it meant to have as my first boss a female Asian American curator. And just when I think about all the artists that she introduced me to in circa 2000, people like Lee Ming-wei, Byron Kim, Frank Moore, Janine Antoni, and Shahzia. So many of these artists, their works are on the wall at the Cantor, and I realize they are artists that you were crucial in supporting. So just wanted to give a little shout out there. But the last thing I want to say is that this gift tonight of hearing Shahzia speak is only possible thanks to the dream team of colleagues that I have in our academic and public programs department. And so I want to just give a little shout out to them tonight. Thank you, Christina Linden, Vivian Sming, Kwong Mi Ro, and Michael Heffernan. It's just been an incredible day, really so stimulating, and you've orchestrated this so beautifully, and I just feel so lucky to never have to think about any of our public programs because they're always just taken care of and done so beautifully. And I also wanted to lastly thank a remarkable group of supporters, many of whom are here in this room, who made it possible to bring the show from Venice via Ohio to California. So thank you so much, Sarah Abbasi, Ted Fries, and Brooke Hartzell, Zain and Farzana Jiwanjanji, and Komal Shah. I'm sure I'm leaving some people out, but really it does, I'm very grateful. And without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Shahzia to the podium. Thank you.
Good evening. I am so honored to have this opportunity to share my work at Cantor and with the Stanford community. Thank you to everyone who is here and whoever is tuning in for your time and attention. Past several weeks, let me get to my talk. Can you share? Okay.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Past several weeks, I was often in Cincinnati, designing and partnering with the city and organizations like Artworks, Wave Pool, and the Cincinnati Art Museum to create a mural on an abandoned and now repurposed art and community use building that at one point used to be a church. The mural painters were all young, many in high school and undergrad. We used the interior of the building as a temporary studio for mixing colors, developing workshops to get the preliminary drawings done while becoming familiar with the work and with each other. The project was led by a group of local MFA artists. It was one of the most rewarding experiences, witnessing the talent, passion, and hard work it inspired in the youth that chose to paint it. The attention to detail, the consistency of line drawing by hand on an uneven brick surface, the care with which each person added something of their own selves into the process while keeping the integrity of the composition. Painting was done directly on the surface of the building, which is at least 3 to 4 stories high, and then because it had a setback in the facade, much of it was also painted directly on parachute cloth, which was later glued to the top sections. The mural is titled Commons and has a female-centered iconography celebrating women's desire to create communities that foster listening, seeing, and mentorship. Majority of the facade was done through a grid and then drawn freehand. Commons is now woven into its environment within the texture of Cincinnati's downtown history and architecture. Public artwork allows artists and viewer to overlap in unexpected ways. A long-term mural creates space for conversation that can build over time. When there is more time to experience an artwork, the nature of response constantly evolves. I am very interested in art that invites contemplation, reaction, reflection, that can linger in the viewer's mind and make them find reason to revisit and rethink. Many characters throughout my work are about archetypal protagonists, those that can showcase flight, movement, courage, flux. To point to an example in the work, for example, the Sphinx here, the character that I call a Chalava, she is prominently featured in red and green in the top center of the mural, but here in this older work, she is a shadow defying a narrow description. Chalava is a term of endearment in Urdu for someone who is so swift that they cannot be boxed into one definition. One example, a grandmother in Pakistan could call her grandkids Chalavas if they were hard to hold on to, leaving her wanting more of their company. She and they appear also as a group of women rowing against the current, effortless, with poise and ease. I have been drawing on paper and walls for a very long time. While drawing is a tool for me to define ideas, I am a believer in drawing's wondrous ability of linking emotion to thought through hand and material. It's a means of imagining and bringing forms to life. While studying the language of pre-modern manuscript painting, its ability to stylize and create mythic forms, I simultaneously began experimenting with scale and time in early mid-90s, creating large, meticulously detailed wall murals layered with quick gestural drawings on transparent paper. The intention was to use fluid, spontaneous gestures that involved the whole body and amplified my invented motifs. This large-scale work required a different kind of labor, skill, and pace than the smaller, intricate compositions. But I saw it as it was in dialogue with classical traditions. What I wanted to create was an openness in the work. As you see in these works, there's no intention to hide anything. Everything is very visible. The paper is very transparent. It flows, it moves. All marks, including any flaws, become a part of the piece, which has no borders and can expand in any direction, marking a side that is unstable and multivalent. Embracing uncertainty and an inner turmoil is a defining feature of the innate human creative spirit. As borders started to shift, the work started to push back at narrow definitions, often used for artists of color. In my case, I was to perform as a miniaturist, and my work had to be understood only through the lens of the culture of the other. Even decades later, as the work grew and evolved very much in conversation and proximity to artists of my generation in the US, including conversations with like Kara Walker, Julie Meritu, Barry McGee, Margaret Kilkerran, Teresita Fernandez, I often realized that how the work I was doing was often defined in terms of my early biography, the Pakistani artist that was making miniature paintings. It became clear that post 9/11, being a Muslim artist and an Asian American artist in the white and black cultural space of the US, one would remain on the periphery, no matter how much one's work was also shaping the American artistic canon. When I moved to New York, it was with the intent to engage with the South Asian community. And over there, I started working with Sharmila, one of the most exciting times of being a young artist before the harsh days of post 9/11. So New York City was outwardly poised. There were many South Asian diaspora artists creating exciting work. And in that move in the late 90s from Houston to New York, I found kinship in those communities overlapping visual as well as performative spaces. And I started like working with these artists and then bringing them back into my practice so that the miniatures became almost like a document, something that was documenting its time and space. And also at the same time, thinking about how to kind of create a vocabulary within the context of a present moment as well as the historical tensions. So such an example would have been this particular work called Spin. Here you can see a court painting. It's referencing a darbar, which is a hall, a formal meeting space traditionally reserved for displays of authority. But I started to think about it in a gendered manner. Like, what if the feminine characters infiltrate and evolve and kind of emerge, and as they create clusters and amass in number, maybe they disrupt this idea or representation of sovereignty or patriarchy. And then as the hair disassociates from their bodies, clearing the hall for other women who briefly assume the throne, the idea was how to use a fragment of their bodies so that you could have both a shape that was a particle system, but it could also be coded. And I started to take a very kind of the head, the shape of the head became like a vector, a code that I could use to create different movements in animation. So, but if you went back and reduced it, it was basically exactly the hair and the shape borrowed from the historical paintings. So this idea of the kinetic and the symbolism of the hair, the particle system, and how drawing has movement and can exist outside of the page started to spill further, and it kind of ended up in one example on the more than 100 billboards in Times Square. Just sharing examples of how the work continues to expand in so many ways, but you can bring it all back to the idea of drawing. In this particular work, I was able to lean into Zaha Hadid's language, her architecture here. And another female visionary whose language spoke of the immense possibilities of space and its futuristic ideas, bringing it into dialogue with tradition. So this upheaval that kind of embodied in these languages, which we so think of in terms of the traditional, was also about how tradition is performed. Who gets to define what is tradition, and what does it really mean? Like this idea of like tradition versus modernity, or contemporary artist that is supposed to not be traditional. So I was really interested in all of these things because there was a way in which the language started to restrict the actual making of the work was very different from the language being used to frame the work. And the more I experimented with my drawings and practice of drawing, I was like, oh, what if I projected and think of drawing as this light? Like, would the drawing projected become a tattoo on a building? So these are like artist residencies that I was doing, but I was really playing with this concept of scaling up and having the work be borderless, and yet engaging with borders, but then pushing back at different ways in which an artwork could exist. So here, some of these are examples of the different projects over time. This one was done at the Doris Duke Foundation, which I was doing a residency, but you couldn't really exhibit there. So I came up with the idea that what if I exhibited through projections in the middle of the night, and it would be without sound, so then it would bypass the restrictions of the very high-end residential neighborhood that it's become, and people could still be able to see the work from at least half a mile away. So these ideas kept on developing, and here is a work called Reckoning, which is also on view here at the show, but I wanted to show that I had first shown it in Times Square, and I also was we did a performance, which was basically 4 Asian American women artists, and the score for this piece was written by the composer Du Yun, and the performances were by Zay Bungush and Eddie Kwan, and it was a performance that would happen every night, and I wanted to show you just a glimpse of it. In 2015, Philadelphia Museum of Art was redoing their permanent South Asian galleries and wanted to find ways to reach to a younger audience through film and animation. One of the staff members shot me an email on my website for advice, and that is how I ended up making this work. It was a very collaborative gesture from the very start, and it sort of established an ongoing partnership with the curator Ainsley Cameron, who also curated the exhibit Collective Behavior, which is on view here at the Cantor. So Disruption as Rapture is an intermediary, interdisciplinary artwork there's painting, animation, original score, and it's about soul's search for and connection with the divine. The original manuscript, Gulshan-e-Ishq, is in the vitrine. And of course, we can't, like, it'll stay in the vitrine, but I wanted people to experience an original manuscript. So it's facsimile, very beautifully produced, is in the outside, and you can peruse through it. So the film itself uses Indo-Persian manuscript painting, motion graphics, South Asian lyrical poetry, Western opera, orchestral music, Indian ragas, Gregorian chants. There's a beautiful score composed by Diyan with vocals by Ali Sethi. It's animated form in high resolution, it was made in 4K. It also gives it the elasticity to be experienced in multiple scales, sites, and situations, which kind of allows the work then to go outside the confines of a gallery or a private collection. And I really was wanting to do that, to bring the miniature so that it could be seen by more people than the ones that would be coming into the museum. So this idea of how tradition is defined and how it is disseminated, that becomes an enduring idea championed in this work. Its disruption as rapture is about a strategy to take the material history of non-Western cultures, like South Asia, that reside in Western museum storages and share it outside of its restrictive confines for broader circulation and interpretation. It was exhibited at what you just saw at the Nuit Blanche Toronto Festival in the outdoor pavilion of the Aga Khan Museum, but then it was also in Pakistan, at the Al-Hamra Gardens, and then also at the fort, Lahore Fort. And at the Lahore Fort, the work was mounted as part of the inaugural 2018 Lahore Biennial, but its score, which was performed live by Diyan and Ali Sethi, it also involved the local children's choir. So that was really quite wonderful to be able to have this porosity in the work, that where it stems from, and then how it has all this ability to keep incorporating more participants, and it can keep growing and evolving. It's currently on view outdoors at the National Museum of Norway. So in 1987, I enrolled at the Lahore College of Arts during, that was still the military dictatorship. It wasn't that I wanted to study art. I was a math major at the Canadian College, but it was more that I wanted to be among creative thinkers that were engaged in dissent and pushing back at the closing in of cultural spaces. So this interest in pre-modern manuscripts was sparked in mid-1980s when abstract expressionism was prevalent in art schools. Craft and traditional languages were kind of looked down upon. So my thesis that is up here, done at that time, The Scroll, is like an epic poem, but there was also a certain playfulness in choosing the format of a scroll, as it naturally lends itself to depicting a narrative about a time, a film, an unfolding of an event, a story, a day, a lifetime. And you can see like this, it's featured in a children's book as well. So there is this idea of like how the scroll is about a young artist's journey, but it's also about a female as a outlier that is emerging in my practice. And the book is Roots and Wings. It's how an artist growing up in Pakistan and just a year of coming into the US, what that meant. So this actually the scroll took me 2 years to make, sometimes 14 to 18 hours a day. I was always working, and I think that kind of made me into a bit of a hermit. And that painstaking labor was challenging, but it was meditative. In 1988-89, when I was working on the work and I graduated in 91, by 92 I was already teaching at the National College of Arts. But that work did receive significant acclaim in Pakistan, and it sparked a noticeable shift. Enrollment surged at the National College of Arts. And at that time, the very tiny miniature painting department started getting more real estate at the college, and it's inspired a new generation to re-engage with indigenous art. So here you can see the young woman stepping over a threshold, symbolized as a frame, takes herself and others into a journey, into an epic poem, possibly through a contemporary home or a historical Safavid painting. Her form is moving through the hyper-detailed, luminous space, restless, diaphanous, hovering between the familiar, unfamiliar. She's, passing through time, but she's not rooted in the moment that the other characters in the piece are, how they exist. So I wanted this idea of the female be defying bodily restrictions by becoming elastic, transparent, morphing form, almost like a ghost-like character. And this, for that piece, I was using photographs of family in and around. So you can see in the children's book, it represents, it says a whole family lives here, parents, sisters, brothers, grandparents, aunts and uncles and cousins, dogs, rabbits, and cats too. It's for a young audience, but it was trying to depict how I grew up in a multi-generational household with my grandparents. And here's a photo from the 80s. And transforming miniature painting's status from traditional and nostalgic to a contemporary idiom became sort of my personal goal after the thesis, the scroll that was created, broke open the mold for what could be considered a contemporary miniature painting in Lahore, Pakistan. But when I moved to the US, I had to carry that burden as a young artist. Something I never negotiated. That's not what I wanted. It was such a heavy burden because, this is the time when you were being seen as the outsider, because the prevalent and polarizing lenses were these dichotomies of East-West, Islamic-Western, Asian-white, oppressive-free. And what happened is that when I got confronted by all of that, it led to an outburst of iconography, of fragmented and severed bodies, androgynous forms, armless, headless torsos, self-rooted, floating half-female, half-woman figures, anything that refused to belong, to be fixed, to be grounded, or to be stereotyped. But what got me deeply hooked into the manuscript painting was also understanding how European colonial legacy shaped pre-modern Central and South Asian manuscript painting's fate. Because so much of the South Asian manuscripts were dismembered and sold for profit during colonial occupation. Many important historical paintings, they reside in collections such as the one that you're seeing here, the Queen's Private Collection at the Royal Library, Windsor Castle. I only saw this work as facsimiles printed in a book. It was much later that I was able to actually physically see this material in flesh. And it is so different seeing it in actual versus what you see. So when I started seeing them and having the opportunity to take a magnifying glass and look at it up close, I was also thinking about the politics of provenance. And so, say, looking at the Padshah-nama right here, where Jahangir receives Prince Khurram, I thought, okay, how is this history being told? Who gets to tell the story? Isn't that all about the hierarchies of power? And what can I do in terms of imagining how this material ended up in the Queen's collection? What is that history? So that history started to point to the history of East India Company, a trading company founded by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600 that ends up wielding commercial and political power in South Asia, including its own private army. And that's the piece that then becomes the last post. Actually, last post is on view right now at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, so it's just kind of interesting after I made it in 2010. But I love that part of the digital work, that it continues to have a life. So anyway, coming back to this work, the East India Company's role in military expansion using Indian soldiers, trade imbalances, its success was fueled by lucrative trade in commodities like tea, cotton, silk, spices, its use of military force to expand its influence, policies, practices, which were also cultural and religious discrimination happening. So anyway, I wanted to conceive this piece by looking at that manuscript page. And that's what I always imagine is like those paintings have been sitting in storage or being seen by just a handful of people. And if all of that material was available to students, in the global south, in Pakistan, if we could have lived with that material and seen it all the time, maybe it would be a very different, it wouldn't exist in this truncated manner. So that is what compels me to keep making and thinking about this practice. But I am, it's all paint on paper. So I am very much invested in drawing. Like drawing is the libretto in this piece too. When I think of working with animation and a composer, I'm thinking, okay, can I make the drawing as a libretto? And how can that allow me to collaborate with the composer? So the last post is a animated video. It's like 10 minutes with an original score. It's made from ink, gouache, watercolors that I painted, then edited, and then layered them and scanned them and altered and threaded them into a moving work. But it has another life. So when I did this public art project at the it's the economics building at Princeton University, and I thought, okay, here is Adam Smith, the economist and philosopher, author of The Wealth of Nations, arguing against monopolies using the demise of the East India Company as a case study. But we are still caught in the same old patterns of inequities of wealth. So for my depiction of Adam Smith, I fashioned him in the company school of miniature painting, and then strapped in this company attire, his lofty ideas, they grow wings, but he's unable to fly. Kind of, he remains fluttering in the economics building of Princeton. So just showing that how these things have power to continue to grow and change, and interpretations are so much about the context of the work as well. So all these histories of maritime trade, movement of resources, commodities such as bodies and oil and naval warfare, imperial air, land travel, this idea of geography, nationality, then all of these things have, they are patterns of divided political power and cultural authority, and they were instrumental in fracturing the subcontinent's interwoven histories as well. So when you become aware of the plurality of all of this and the trade routes, you have to understand that there is influence on Western wealth and culture from these same histories of trade and exchange. And that for me is a really powerful idea of why I make art, is also to share all these sort of things, these routes that are usually invisible and never ever really explored in Western art history. Power in the time of East India Company isn't really all different than today. Power is exercised across nations and boundaries through networks of corporations, supranational institutions. But if we think about power, empire now, you can also think that all resources that are being gathered in the rubric of monetization, whether it's language, labor, or human intelligence. Ecstasy as Sublime, Heart as Vector is another work at Princeton. It's like a 70-foot stacked up mosaic in glass and stone, and its compositional structure is such that it starts from the bottom of the building and goes right to the top. But its themes are also the same idea of human economic interconnectivity, a struggle for truth, and there are lots of references to history, religion, and literature. I see it literally like the scroll painting, like a poem, a visual poem, except its horizontal cinematic idea has been turned upside vertical. So just sharing how, again, it's connected to the practice of drawing. So all of these works that I'm sharing, they can all the sketches and the ideas are actually done to scale, and you can see also like the drawing leads to all these different possibilities. But these themes of struggle and conflict, memory, migrancy, tradition, and of ultimate frame against which experience unfolds its death and its opposite life. So that's a very broad theme, but it is a very powerful theme that runs through my practice. So I started doing mosaics at that time. I had to solve this. I won this commission for Princeton University, and I had never really done a permanent public art project. So that's when I'd start thinking of like, oh, how could I use glass? Because glass becomes a metaphor for light, strength, fragility, opaqueness, transparency, malleability. And what led me to mosaic was actually animation. It was the dynamism of the pixel that emerged as a unit. And that became suddenly very exciting. So it wasn't about here is an image and somebody has to reproduce it in mosaic. It was like, how can I create mosaic that is internally something different? Almost like its structure is broken up, and you can look at a detail, and the detail offers you a lot. It's not just a reproduction of an image, but it has its own relationship to its own history and language. And for that, I have spent time doing research in Ravenna, in Italy, in so many different places, looking at the Byzantine mosaics, and also looking at the Islamic mosaics in Syria and in different places where, unfortunately, one was unable to visit. But those are histories that illuminate the language that was shared across the region. Again, it's not just relegated to Western art history. It existed outside. So this idea of the in-between is very prevalent in my practice. The in-between or the middle ground. And that is also in this piece, which is called Metaxu. It's sort of a lush garden landscape with vibrant pieces of multicolored glass. But to describe this state of a human being who is always nomadic. But Metaxu is also the condition of those who pursue lifelong paths to truth and knowledge, as expressed through the philosopher Simone Weil. So these fragmented states are pretty prevalent. You can see how they come in and out in this language of mosaic and digital, as well as in the miniature paintings. And I just wanted to share here some details which up close clarify the relationship between the pixel and the unit of the mosaic. I have been experimenting, with all different ways of taking the idea of a drawing. And in many works, the score can often allow participation. So in this work that I did in Istanbul, the score was performed constantly live with sopranos, and it was exciting, very like a different level of urgency. But when I think that all of this is coming about through the lexicon in the drawn archives, but you can go and revisit them for all sorts of collaboration. And this interest is in this current work that I did in Ravenna, which is on view right now in the Mosaic Biennial. Here I started experimenting with actually the miniature painting technique back into the mosaic. So this is one example of like, now the mosaic is moving back into the language of miniature painting. So it's always, I think, always moving in cyclical ways. And I just think sometimes that, how do you make these decisions? Some forms and ideas speak instantaneously to music, movement, and some hint at sculptural directions. But as an artist, I think I always leave the possibilities open for more ideas to fall in place. And, that's the nature of being an artist. And I feel like poets are great examples of having such a vision. Anyway, my interest in tracing how languages emerge and how I can capture them in my practice is also by looking at sculpture. Sculpture, once damaged or censored, continues to live in altered forms, how their absence, wounds, and restorations become part of their narrative identities. This research ultimately laid out some of the conceptual foundations for my paintings, a constellation of ideas about severance, absence, censorship, renewal, the missing head, its contested visibility. They together form an evolving language of resistance and remembrance. You can see a repertoire of these forms in a work like this, where, the figures are like moving in different directions. Some can be androgynous, some are monstrous, but they could be a collection of alter egos. But at the back was my concern about the lack of female artists represented in art history and the art world, and the misogyny women often encounter in almost all spheres of life and work. So the act of drawing became about converting erasure into opportunity, often through wit and candor. One example, this is really interesting, is this work that I created on the right, A Slight and Pleasing Dislocation. It was a mural that I was invited to create at the Skaddenarps law firm in New York City around 2000. And then I was looking at the representation of law, the power of the law, which is basically the mural at the appellate courthouse. And you can see often like the power of law is represented through a white woman with a sword. All I did was imagine this very ubiquitous depiction of women and jurisprudence within the context of Western art history, but refracted through a non-Western art history lens, with the South Asian feminine archetype, say Durga, a metaphor for sharp intellect and wisdom. So I was making this sculpture. This is just a fragment out of a 70-foot mural I was making at the Skaddenarps law firm. And 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden, I was asked to exit from this project. And because it evoked fear, the fear of the other, fear being projected, it was mislabeled as violent and eventually censored, and I was asked to remove it. So, I just basically came in the middle of the night and took my entire work, and it was sitting in storage for 20 years. And years later, in 21, when, or maybe a little bit before then, I was working with a PhD student, and they were like, why don't you tell these stories? Bring that work out. And we started to think about it. I was like, oh, it's unfinished, I don't know. And it was like, oh, learn to tell these stories with younger people. So eventually, the interesting history of the city that I live in, and I love New York City, is that gets censored in 2001. 20 years later, I am at the same courthouse making a collaborative work there. So it was just kind of, I think it's really interesting to see this kind of paradox. So when Madison Square Park came and they were like, oh, you want to do a project, and we were looking at their site, which is right across the courthouse. So then it eventually led to a conversation with the courthouse, they were very keen to partner with us, and we ended up making the piece, which is called Now. But even Now, which is on the roof of the courthouse, if you look at Now and you look at the painting it was based on, this painting, I'm not sure if it's in the show, but this painting, Uprooted Order, was something I did a long time ago in the 90s, and it is about the paradox of rootedness. How this idea of assimilation versus foreignness, and this character is figuring out how to deal with this assumption of the fallacy of assimilation versus, whatever is the foreignness. So I took that painting and was like, oh, can a painting become a sculpture? And let's see how I could do that. And so Now is upright, defiant, luminous, within the grounds of the courthouse. It's like something, born from urgency, but also a need to reassert the presence of women in spaces of power, justice, and public discourse. So, though she may stand in for so many, in her self-rooted appendages, a visual metaphor for those who carry their roots wherever they go. So this idea of the roots is really like these forms that are self-rooted, like women. For me, it's about women. They can carry their roots wherever they go. They have resilience. They are connected through memory, through histories, through shared storytelling. So she stands upon a symbol of humility, awakening, clarity, the lotus, with the invisible roots of the lotus beneath the water. And they also echo the rhizome form, which is basically the roots grow sideways and they are connected to each other. So as they grow, they get entangled and they are origin-less. So this is how I understand identity, not fixed but layered, interconnected, and constantly becoming. So when I was making this other work, which was in the park, I was looking at the ceiling and of the courthouse, and this is a gorgeous, beautiful ceiling by Maitland Armstrong, and I was thinking, oh, maybe that can be a reference to the skirt. And then the female is basically breaking out of the symbolic glass ceiling. And the female skirt becomes a space of community, a space of refuge. It's malleable, expanded skirt. It becomes a metaphoric space for collective female agency, which is how I was thinking about this form decades ago. And there's mosaics and storytelling also on the skirt as well. But coming to the decorative collar, the lace jabot, which was sort of a nod to the feminization of the Black judicial robe, popularized by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and first introduced by Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. So I was making these beautiful drawings with the pulp paper, and I was thinking about the collar, and then it was a natural way to bring it right into this piece. And then there was the hair. So in the courthouse itself, there's a lot of decorative program rooted in the 1900s. So you can see these ram's horns and carved into the bench chairs. So all I did was take the ram and its horn, which is also in the frieze on the facade of the building, and then also look at the 20th century Nigerian crest masks, then also the Buddha's spiraling snail shell hair curls that sit on Buddha's head. So if you looked at sideways, they also have the same formation. You know, as a visual artist, you're always thinking, playing, creating different associations. So this is where it was coming from. It is not about Medusa. And the braids, they twisted into ram's horns, but ram's horns can be a universal symbol of strength and wisdom. It was already a language in the courthouse. So later, you know, it does become a big issue where it's like, oh, they are like devil's horns, and that led to the censorship of the work, and somebody actually beheaded it. So this idea of this rootedness or self-rootedness is also in the limbs, and you can see that in the drawings. You can see that how I'm taking the drawings and kind of figuring out how to convert it into sculpture through using kind of copper wire in the foam, and then also looking at paintings that I had done, especially around post 9/11 censorship, like Pleasure Pillars on the right. You know, this work I did soon after 9/11. Actually, it was a show at the Asia Society, and I had finished the work, and then 9/11 happens, so the show got not canceled, postponed. And the work came back to me, and I unframed it and started painting on it. So, but Gayatri Gopinath wrote this wonderful thing that Pleasure Pillar is a comment on gendered bodies, especially in the context of war on terror. So it's kind of, if you recall, the initial human rights justification for the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 was to, quote unquote, save Muslim women. Pleasure Pillar's central head, an amalgamation of various feminist thinkers and poets, speaks back to such paternalistic gender discourses and insists on reviving forgotten, submerged narratives, genealogies, and traditions of joyous, sensuous, confident, full of strength, gendered embodiments. And that's where this idea of the sculpture sort of emerges. So I just wanted to share that what I was doing as a visual artist was taking elements that already existed in my practice and thinking, can they come together to create a sculpture? But oftentimes different portraits are of people I know, like my sister has also she's been a model for me, but this was a piece where I created a portrait of Mary Magdalene for Tosca, and Mariam and Mary, and I was thinking, okay, how can all of that come together? And this is a piece which is called Mary -am, but it's about the various Miriams, different connotations of that. So, but these are examples of women, and many of them, they are poets, and they are thinkers, and they are seers, and they have shaped me. Not only shaped me, but inhabited me. And I can think of many, but I'll just mention a few. Sara Ahmed, Bell Hooks, Adrienne Rich, Fahmida Riaz, Perveen Shakir, Solmaz Sharif, Audre Lorde, Angela Carter, Rebecca Solnit, like it goes on and on. And this is a practice which is on the side, but I wanted to share this because oftentimes the question is, oh, who is it about? It's about all of them. It's about a state of being and thinking. So those are the characters that you often see in the work, and often they are stylized through the language of the manuscript painting. So they may start from a poet or a thinker that inspired me, but then by the time I kind of stylize that face, it changes. So a rose here is about the two women that are tethered to time. They are portrayed as a circular bloom. They are buoyant, they are afloat, they exist actually untethered to any specific time or space, but they are also a critical part of the natural environment. That's how I was thinking, okay, how else can I think about these languages? And that idea of the feminine coming together is in the promiscuous intimacy. So that sculpture, which is also in the show, but here I just wanted to share that if you look at them, that's the Greco-Roman Venus and the Indian Devata. But what is promiscuous intimacies? It's a term that I borrowed from Gayatri Gopinath's essay of that title. And it's about multiple times, spaces, multiple traditions, bodies, desires, subjectivities. So the Venus and the Devata, in their suggestive embrace, they are also about female bodies that bear the symbolic weight of communal identities across multiple geographic, temporal terrains. So I had originally conceived it as a sketch for a banner at MoMA in 2000. But I was also looking at, how art history's very classicism and ethnocentric reactions to Indian art, especially sort of like Winckelmann's doctrine. And then I was thinking, how could I look at mannerism, which was an anti-classical impulse within the Western art tradition. And if I connected mannerism with Indian art, maybe both become accomplice witnesses of a one-sided history. And that's sort of the premise for the MoMA banner, which was basically Much Maligned Monsters, which was in response to Partha Mittar's 1977 book, Much Maligned Monsters, A History of European Reactions to Indian Art, which points to the role of cultural stereotypes in the European perception of Asia. And, I was looking at the mannerist painting, the allegory with Venus and Cupid. But in this work, the most important work that, was also like the Devata here on the right, which was in Met's collection till 23, and then it was repatriated to India because it had a problematic history. It was stolen. And so I remember in 2000 being aware of the suspect history. But it took 20 plus years later that eventually it got returned. It's just that as artists, you're always doing research. As artists, you're always sniffing around, and you're making things that may be so much ahead of their time. So for me, this sculpture then has even more resonance, a whole 2 decades later, and the way it's being talked about by a younger generation of artists. So that was really important for me, that it was a tiny little sketch in a painting I did a long, long time ago, and then pulled that sketch out and made it into a sculpture, and it offered new interpretations. But this idea of how to center women, centering women, often as agents of resistance and change. And here you see this painting is called Land of Tears, and the gifts beneath the trees are 2 female forms, one living, one a skeleton, holding on to one another for affirmation and support, as though summoning the strength of ancestors. So it's a series of works that I call loosely the Christmas tree series. Basically, oil rigs that have come to symbolize the tragedy of capitalism, premised on the instrumentalized extraction of the Earth's natural resources to the point of depletion and planetary destruction. So the motif was based on a photograph of an oil pumping platform from a 1962 British Petroleum magazine, in which I discovered that actually the oil rigs were known as Christmas trees due to their conical shaped, piped branches and chains. So I took this photograph that I saw in one of my researches and made the tree out of it on the left. But if I was thinking of them as promised abundance while being engines of extraction, it became really a very powerful emblem. And there's a whole bunch of work that kind of plays with that idea, and you can see it also in the animation Parallax. But this trope of femininity has served me so much. When I think of it as a maker of iconographies, I'm also borrowing from literature this notion of the female in conversation with erasure, the visible-invisible divide. Feminine is often portrayed as the abject, the fecund, the immense, the vulnerable. There's intimacy, selfhood, valor, resistance, like femininity's intersection with race and war, often as a marker of the fear that lurks when boundaries melt. So this femininity is often the tension between women and power. How society perceives such a dynamic, how often erasure is enacted by social forces that shape women's lives. So this work is kindred. It hints at the novel of Octavia Butler, but the image on the left. And when I was making this, I was working with ink. So the female face emerged while I was painting Africa, like an upside down in the painting. And then this notion of the sea, the large oceanic space around the globe, it's actually constructed with Urdu text. It's a phrase from Ghalib's poetry, and it informs that the work of an artist is never done. But it may be a play on rote, but the work also questions the paradox of learning against the enigma of incompletion. So, I made it look as like water and writing. But then I looked at an image of our world from a satellite image, and it was uncanny, its resemblance. That's human clutter in space. So that, these are wonderful, for me, just wondrous ways in which, as an artist, when you're working, and then you're like, oh, doesn't that look kind of similar? So this idea of how environment, issues around environment that are of interest to me. And when I was thinking about witness, I was also thinking that how could I create a piece that was also transparent, that would reveal the grass, the trees, the cityscape that spawn its environment. So that's how at night it would work. And it was also a site for a lot of public programs that were open to all, and they were shaped by many New Yorkers and different communities that came there. And it centered on this notion of the collective. Power is elusive. It affects all. It operates through hierarchies and conflict. But power does belong to a group. So it was really kind of exciting to see this. And then also when the work went to Houston, and then there were protests around the sculpture, and there was so much misinformation. And not only that, you know, from the sort of very start, what kind of was disappointing that the University of Houston, when they installed the work, they failed to put the essential signage about the art. I don't know for what, under what pressure, but there were allegations from the Texas Right to Life that the work was honoring abortion. So not only was the artist's work canceled, the talk was canceled. Anyway, in July, at 3 a.m., someone at the University of Houston grabbed a hammer and decapitated it, acting in the middle of the night, an hour before Beryl hurricane hit. It was so clear that the intent was to cloak the narrative to the storm. So, you know, vandalism was premeditated and intentional, but yet there was confusion around it that, oh, the storm did it. But there is a video footage that somebody climbed on it and did it intentionally. Anyway, the work was beyond repair. I was not interested in repairing it because for me, I want to leave it as it is, for all to see the violence that speaks to its history. Concealing this act of hate takes the power away from the art. Instead of censoring and covering the destroyed art with a tarp, we should have encouraged independence of thought, a conversation with students, you know, to see things beyond binaries, and to engage with the complexities of history, autonomy, for the right for women to be heard and seen. So anyway, this whole act of silencing was so much around misinformation and confusion. And for me, you know, that's where it comes back like a circle, like where does the power lie in an image? How are beliefs tied to reproduction of cultural knowledge? Immigrant diaspora communities are what creates America, born of people whose culture is enriched by hardships, joys, and sorrows. We are living through a period of extreme polarization, and we see the politics of division rising, where the complexity of nuance, so essential to both art and citizenship, is under threat. And in the face of all that, you know, we must continue to protect spaces where multiplicity thrives. And I say that, like, as an artist, you know, institutions like the museums have to play a role because they are not just a repository for objects, they are a container for possibilities. The most vital museums are those that are porous to history, to community, to contradiction. They are places where meaning is not prescribed but made in dialogue over time, and sometimes they become battlegrounds for what we choose to value and remember. But also at the same time, as an Asian artist, I am equally aware of the token representation. There are so many instances in the last 20, 30 years of exhibitions that I have done in museums, and I may have done a show there, but none of those museums have ever collected my work. So one is very acutely aware that you may be servicing this agenda of diversity, but at the end of the day, how many of those institutions would ever collect your work? And that is a very real situation in conversation with so many other South Asian artists that I've had. And I think those politics are very close to the politics of how other cultures through colonial histories are collected in Western art, Western institutions, storages. And some of those politics, you know, they play a role in my artwork. And Parallax is one example. It's on view here. Parallax embodies all sorts of power and conflict, but it's also about omission and loss. And it's, again, on maritime trade, geographical borders that separate bodies of land, water, human, natural resources, oil, opium, tea. But they also are about who contributes to the sense of belonging or exclusion from a geographically determined space. So when I was making Parallax for the Sharjah Art Biennial, it got realized in this abandoned cinema that I encountered in one visit to this very small port town called Khor Fakkan in UAE. So when I went there, the caretaker who was living there he came in 1976 to build the building. I met him in 2012. He was living in this abandoned building. He was from Pakistan, and he was equally surprised to see me knocking on the door. And so he becomes like the last, since it was a cinema, so I played with like projections, and he becomes like a viewer for my work. So we talked, and I was there for a week, and I was thinking about his life, his love, his existence, so intricately intertwined with the space that the imminent death of the cinema, it was an abandoned theater which was going to be remade into something else, it, in my eyes, became a metaphor for his life's labor. The caretaker, as a sole survivor, becomes the protagonist in Parallax. So, things happen in so many different ways, but again, my practice is so much about finding ways in which to research and go in the direction of intuitively wherever the research takes you. So just wanted to share that, again, I've been really blessed that this work, Parallax, has traveled over 20 different countries over the years, and that for an artist, you want the work to circulate, you want the work to be seen. And here are some other examples of the work was at the Amtrak station. And here it was these singing suns are actually made from details of this work. Just basically scorched earth reflecting sunlight. And its rotation is aided through this army of women silhouettes, which are kind of like spike-likes. It's like a wheel. But art at the end of the day, for me, is so much about art. It's knowledge construction. It's about how can we reckon with the otherness in a shifting world, how we approximate, reproduce, or how we reenact our culture and history. Whatever we make, consume, and give back, it has resonance and consequence beyond our immediate lives. So a lot of my practice is anchored in teaching. I am constantly engaging with younger people, with students, so that collaborative nature allows multiple possibilities. I think it allows different interpretations. It opens up the space for more people to gather. And for me, it means that I'm talking with people, and we are often researching the archives and historical folios, and how those archives are so many times full of gaps because so many people are not represented in them. And that reminds me of how much I love Saidiya Hartman and her critical fabulation concept, of combining research, critical theory, and fiction to bridge gaps in colonial and Orientalist narratives. I'm going to end soon, just 2-3 more slides, but this idea, the collective behavior exhibit, first opened as part of the Venice Biennial. So I think that is also exciting, that the context of Venice, because Venice is also a site where trade migration is at its foundation. And there is a rich history between Venice and Persia, China, Africa, and there are mixed and borrowed motifs that reverberate through the Italian Renaissance paintings, illuminated manuscripts, and textiles of the Islamic world, including histories of glass, which led me to create works that incorporated glass, lace, textile, pulp. And So again, through these materials, the in-between idea of, okay, how can I channel Venice? It's a history of human and water, citizen and migrant, material, imaginary. It's real, it's mythic. So this image of the migrant love on the right emerge. It's like these are characters or maybe forms that become characters that are interconnected. You can see their roots are now interconnected to each other. They are autonomous, they can be resilient, but they became a metaphor for movement and existence of people across borders. So it was also inspired by the Venice Biennial's theme of foreigners everywhere. And these are the lines of connection. They are everywhere. If we choose to look closely and without prejudgment, those lines of connection are everywhere in all sorts of places. And that's when I started thinking about lace. So I was like, after those visits to Venice, I was like, what are these amazing histories of lace and how lace is threaded, broken apart, and rebuilt, how it carries the weight of the feminine, whether as a textile of childhood or memories of grandmothers. So I was doing a residency at the Zuckerman Institute of Brain, Mind, and Behavior, and then I became very interested in memory. So I was looking at these photographs and these patterns, and I was thinking, the lace reminded me of the intricate mechanisms of the brain. And maybe there was a way to think about lace and memory and brain and all of that just percolating in one's thought, and it led to a meeting with Dr. Scott Small, a neuroscientist who's an expertise in Alzheimer's disease and cognitive aging, but who had also written this amazing book on how essential forgetting is for creativity. And so we ended up collaborating on an artist's book, which was published by Editions Take 5, which basically looks at the importance of forgetting to create new connections. And I think that is basically what I just wanted to say is, like we have to deal with all sorts of erasures and trauma and move forward in time and space. And for me, that's really important as an artist, as a creative thinker, because the exhibition at the Cantor is dedicated to my father, Sikander Rashid Ahmed. But when I was a child, he instilled through his words and actions that nothing mattered more than cultivating non-judgmental, almost like a childlike curiosity, because remaining curious makes us empathetic, humble, and never complacent. So I've channeled that advice through adversity and struggle, and I pass it on to my son and to my students and to the younger generation every day. So I want to end with a quote by the poet Kaveh Akbar: "Art is where what we survive survives." Thank you.
That was one of the best presentations I've ever heard an artist give, and you're making it very hard. Yeah. And I think we all just got to experience what it might be like to be one of your students, and now I want to be one of your students. Like maybe we need to both start going to Columbia and being your students, but that was incredible. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahzia. And I really just have like a couple of summary remarks and really just only one question on my end in the interest of time. And then I'm sure Veronica has one too, but I wrote them down because I don't usually get nervous, but I'm in the presence of such an amazing artist so I like to come prepared. So first of all, I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. It's always so great to see such a packed house, and for Christina and Vivian and the team for putting this entire day together. We've been gathering all day in your honor. It really is an honor to have you here at the Cantor, and it has been a long time coming. I told myself I wouldn't be able to breathe and feel satisfied with the show until you saw it. And so when you really were unfortunately not able to make it here in September, we were all so disappointed for your sake and for my sake and my ability to breathe and relax. But it's very thrilling to have you here now, and I think I can say on everyone's behalf that we've all learned so much from your talk today and from this amazing gathering. It was so inspiring for those of you who were able to join us earlier today to listen to our incredible panelists. This interdisciplinary, intergenerational group of Shahzia appreciators is such a testament to your brilliant capacity as an artist and the community that you create. Thank you to Eugenie, Sonia, Vijay, and Padma for being here today. Like I said, I just feel a little starstruck and elated to share the stage with you this evening, and that I get to call this work. So, and also it was really a pleasure to steward the presentation of collective behavior here at the Cantor. I wanted to mention that the presentation of collective behavior here at the Cantor is, of course, as Veronica so kindly mentioned, part of the Asian American Art Initiative, which I co-founded and co-direct with art history professor Marcy Kwan, who can't be here tonight because she's traveling on our behalf in Chicago. You rarely see both of us in the same room. This happens all the time. And we started this back in 2018 to help provide meaningful platforms of support for Asian American artists whose work still remains critically under-recognized in museums and academia. This is clearly the case throughout history, and as you've discussed, Shahzia, and into the present day, especially given our current political climate. But I would also say that our current climate is not an aberration, but rather the historical norm. I want to mention that this exhibition is the most significant exhibition presented, most significant solo exhibition of an Asian American artist we have presented in conjunction with the initiative to date, and the first to focus on a South Asian artist. It may very well be the largest solo exhibition of an Asian American artist the museum has ever mounted, but given that we've been around since 1894, I haven't made it through all the exhibition files yet, so I don't want to say that definitively just yet. But no matter what, it's a very big deal for us. Speaking of history, I was so moved by Eugenie's presentation on your early part of your career in the 1990s in New York, where you and Eugenie first met, and as Veronica mentioned, Eugenie is such a legendary curator in her own right, and I've told her this many times, but I know that I'm able to do the work that I can do with the initiative, in part because of what you've done. And so I'm grateful to have you here, and as always, given that we've spent the greater part of today talking about the arc of your career, Shahzia, I want to take this moment to ask you if you wouldn't mind doing some self-conscious reflection with us. What does it feel like to look back in time and see these different parts of your life and artistic practice, or think about who you've worked with, or reflect on how your work has been received? Looking at those incredible archival photographs that Eugenie shared with you, with all of us earlier today, of you with your artist colleagues like Julie Moretu and Kara Walker, Rick Lowe, and Fred Wilson, does it feel like history when you are making it, when you are in it? All of these artists, yourself included, are part of our contemporary canon, or were you not, and do you not think this way? I ask this because I'm someone who chronically historicizes life in the present. I think that's in part due to being on a college campus where we think about the past and present as much as we do about the future. And not all worthy artists are given the opportunity and platform to reflect on their work. This is especially the case of women artists, artists of color, and immigrant artists. So I'd love to hear from you directly some reflections about the day and your place in art history more generally.
Wow.
No big deal, but just like a little.
I know, maybe you guys, you can help me.
Is your,
Yes. Is it?
I think so. I think it's working. Can you hear her? Can you hear her?
Yes.
No? Not so much? Should you swap? We could hear
There we
Elisa.
go.
Why don't you swap?
Sorry about that.
There we go.
No, I really wish that I took more photos then, or somebody was documenting. It was such a different time. Nobody, as a young artist, maybe I was thinking why we were never documenting. I did so many murals and public art projects and have nothing to show for them. Even, I think, lack of guidance, maybe coming from cultures that often have oral histories and not where every little thing has to be documented. And then in a culture where every little thing can be documented and nothing can become a big deal. So I feel that there is a sense of loss, for sure. Especially, you know, you're never thinking you're suddenly going to be in your 50s. So it's like, wait a second, what happened? So there's that. And, but, you know, I think the nature of the art world is constantly changing, hopefully for the better, but definitely has much wider representation, and it's not just myopic and New York focus. It's across the world, and I think at that time, perhaps, you know, lack of social media and internet and all gave it the impression that it was all about being in the moment in the city because of its very commercial nature as well. So so when I think of that, I feel like, you know, very lucky to have met with amazing artists and to have exhibited alongside them and to have, but I feel like that's the nature of being young. You have different energy, you are taking more risk. Well, you're always taking risks, but it was that kind of spirit of, like, you know, just running around and moving from one place and choosing to not live with uncertainty and to develop a stomach for uncertainty. I think that's critical. I think my biggest fear is always how I don't want to become complacent, whatever drives that, I'm not sure. But maybe there is something there to unpack. And I think also my generation of artists, like I mentioned, like when I was at RISD, I actually took Kara's studio. So we Kara Walker's studio. So we overlapped there. Then it was one of my many jobs to fund for my education was I had to recruit or show new artists. So I picked up Julie Mary in '94 from the train station in Providence and showed her around and convinced her to come to RISD. That was one of the jobs I had. And she, I think, had a full scholarship to Tyler. So then there's that history. Then there is moving to Houston and making connections there with the different diasporas, learning about civil rights histories and movements. And I even went to the Million Man March. I think it happened in Dallas or somewhere. I have all these memories, that curiosity to learn about the shifts with North and South, and what are the overlaps in different diasporas, where we all can connect. So I think pre 9/11, you could see that one was part of exhibitions which weren't really defined by race. As such, I think. I was in exhibitions at the Project Row Houses alongside other African American artists, and it was never an issue. And later I remember being kind of creating a work that a young curator wanted to put that work in the Studio Museum Harlem's show, but somehow racially you got. Yeah, which is, so one has seen so many different cycles of representation, and as Asian American artists, I think it's just unfortunate, the burden that you carry. Because no matter how you're thinking, or I'm just an artist, but then how you're being, the optics of how you're being placed and seen is often through very severe limitations that you're a token representation, which is kind of true if I look at the pattern of how the work has been collected. You know, work was collected early in the 90s and then nobody collected the work for like decades. So those are things that are probably not necessarily known, but if I share and compare notes with artists of my generation, they have very different trajectories. But if I compare notes with artists that are all South Asian diaspora, they have very similar histories.
Well, it's interesting to think about, you mentioned archives and that you come from a tradition that also is more oral and also just the pre-digital, right? You don't have the documentation and you didn't have someone advising you and perhaps the way that someone would now. But I think it raises an interesting question of, perhaps, how will your career be remembered? And perhaps there's a way to do oral histories with, I'm just struck by, as Elisa mentioned, these amazing peers that you have been in conversation with in a really deep way. And you mentioned also Margaret Kilgallen and Barry McGee, but yes, Houston, Project Row Houses. So maybe there's a way to also have your archive, a future archive, include a lot of oral histories instead of just perhaps the documentation you wish you had. I think there's still hope, is I guess what I'm saying. I think there's still hope.
I have some friends at the Smithsonian who do a lot of oral histories at the Archives of American Art. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. And I want to make sure we leave time for questions, because I see a really packed audience here, and I know we've taken a lot of time, but I just wanted to thank you also, though, for some of what you shared goes so beyond the exhibition, but helps us see it in a different light. And I was really struck the unfinished mural that she showed that was at Skadden Arps, which I'm so glad that student who told you you need to get this out of your studio or your house or the basement. It's such an incredible work, and the way you then but what I didn't realize was the way you're back now at the same courthouse with the sculpture on the roof. I mean, that is so powerful. All of us, when we go to New York, we are all going to go down and look at that woman, and we are going to know the history of that space and how I just think that's so remarkable, that sort of trajectory. And that sculpture is very similar to, of course, the one we have in the lobby here, which was a lot of work for our team to put on view, but felt very, like we really fought to get that sculpture here at the museum. But I don't even think either Elisa or I really understood the cyclical nature and the power of that particular history. Is really incredible. But that's not a question, so that was more of a thank you. I do want to open it up to this group, though, and we can pass. Does anyone have mics? Yes, Vivian, of course, has a mic, so if anyone has questions, I want to make sure we have a moment to answer a few of them. And Vivian's over here in the corner, or you can just wave your hand and we'll come to you. Yes, there in the front.
Thank you so much. That was really rich and beautiful. And sort of picking up off of Elisa's question about recording and going to the work that you were just showing about forgetting and the power of forgetting. And I'd love to hear you think through more the idea of forgetting as being also a creation of a generation of possibilities. I think we live in a moment where nostalgia and looking to the past has dangers as well as possibilities. And so I'm curious to see the way forgetting is also operative in your work and what that project opened up for you.
Well, it's a very beautiful book. I recommend, it's a scientific book on how the brain sort of how it's almost like if you were cutting grass, like it needs to give more air and space. So when I read it, I was like, validated. It's okay to not remember.
Yeah.
And in fact, if I think as immigrant artists, as immigrant people, we have the burden to remember on other people's behalf, or to remember so much. It's like oftentimes the conversations are, oh, do you remember so-and-so? You went to elementary school with them, and I can't. Sometimes I can't, and sometimes you're like made guilty that, oh, I can't remember. And when I read this book, I was like, oh, it's okay. And almost that it's essential for an artist, for a creative. We all are creative. So for creativity, and it makes sense to kind of exit states of trauma and not to necessarily dwell. But I think it's not the pathological forgetting. It's not that. It's the everyday. So obviously, I think it was very exciting to be in residence amongst scientists, and to also think about neuroscience, the aesthetics, but also to think about, as a visual artist, as a painter, as a writer. I think there was a writer, myself, and a musician, and that all these disciplines are equally critical in terms of human experience and our shared experience of storytelling and creating history. So for me, I think it's really, I find ways to create these detours. Go out of the way to do things that may not necessarily be what is expected of you. Yeah. And because in that moment, you might find the unexpected joys and stumble upon things that have profound interest and implications and push you, as I said, how not to be complacent. But you get, on the other flip side of that is you do get punished for it because you're not in your studio making the art. So of course it affects your commercial career because you're always researching or doing things or collaborating and not creating the object.
Those aren't the artists, though, that have the lasting legacy that you will. So,
We have the question right here.
So thank you for your wonderful presentation. That was really helpful. As a fellow South Asian immigrant who thinks about tokenization as you do, not from an artist perspective, but in other ways, seeing how popular you are and your works are in museums and in cities and conservative places like Scandinavian, I wouldn't have thought you think of yourself as being tokenized because it's so popular. I would have gone, from our vantage point, you're giving us the access and the acknowledgement that we don't always get. And so what do you think it'll take as a community, as an artist, to not be viewed as being just tokenized?
So I'll give you an example. Like when, like a gallery representation, oftentimes there's pressure, where are your people? Where are your people? They need to come and buy your work. It's like, what about the gallery's business in cultivating an audience? Right there, it's like, okay, how many daisies are sitting on the boards of museums or in positions of power, or even it will probably be several more generations before when we think about art as how essential it is for representation. I think those are my experiences. Like there is definitely that space, and I wonder if you can attest to that. Oftentimes it's like a handful of, because art and commerce are bedfellows forever. So it puts a lot of pressure on artists that, you need to bring in people who will support financially your work. So now not only do you have to make the art, but now you also have to play a role.
Yeah, it's thinking about who are the gallery dealers, who's writing about the work, who's showing the work. It's why I now realize having Eugenie as my first boss was remarkable. I didn't, at the time that seemed normal, but I now realize in retrospect how unusual that was. But I do think we are in our field, at least within the museums, and I know you were saying you're not in that world. There's been a real backsliding in the last few months of, the new hires of directors are all white men, many of whom are wonderful and amazing and very talented. But I'm noticing a real shift in who's getting hired in positions of power. But I just have to point out that our board chair is a Pakistani-born woman. Just have to point that out.
And I have to say that this exhibition is also thanks to that.
Yeah, right? And it is thanks to that. It is. So
But
Yes.
coming back to this idea of tokenizing, I think, you know, of course, at that time when I got invited to be in the ScanOps project, I was like in my 20s, and it was that moment when you're getting attention. At that time, everybody's interested. I'm thinking, what happens in terms of support of mid-career women artists? When you actually need the support, when your work has evolved and developed, it's like, okay, did any of those museums come back to support the work? No. They probably bought all that work for under $500. Not that, of course, it's relative to that time, but it's also like, how can we tick mark one, and then it's the same thing. Galleries will have maybe one South Asian artist. Why can't they have more than one? To that level of tokenizing is what, but optics might be different. And of course, here you're seeing, you know, a selection of works over 3 decades. So, but I was kicked out of that project at the ScanOps anyway. But when I'm speaking with other South Asian and Asian artists, I'm always saying that, unfortunately, you know, you have to do so much more work. It's never going to be easy. So you just have to keep working harder, and you have to hustle more, or whatever it takes. So, and that it never is one way. It goes up and it goes down.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just add one, that's, you know, unfair of that gallerist to put that burden back onto you. And it's also making an assumption that your audience and community is solely the South Asian diasporic community, which it is not. And, you know, artists are making work for all of us, and you are clearly in community with so many different artists and people. And so I just find that like a very limited view, and it's also one that it's the additional burden of being like a tokenized artist of color, but then also the expectation that you must bring along with you an entire like coterie of people who, and somehow it is not their job to support it, you know. But I think my hope is that things are changing now, that we have different people who are gallerists, who are museum directors, who are curators, who are writers, and there's more writers and critics out there than there used to be. You were talking about the New York Times and how that was like really the stamp of approval, you know, in the 90s. And my hope is that it's at least a little different now.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
It's very different from those days, but I think it requires a lot more participation, rigor, and often and letting others also have a role in decision making, letting, you know, opening up the boards, opening up representation, and giving more space to all sorts of artists. I think unfortunately it's such a subjective idea, art is. So you know, oftentimes I'm always telling students that, you know, there's no one path, and it's best to realize, like, question yourself, why do you want to do this? What compels you to make art? And I think that is something that I have to deal with every day, that there has to be a good enough reason.
Vivian, oh yeah, just want to note time that, okay, yeah.
I think this is a good follow-on to your last statement, Shahzia. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your lecture. How do you cultivate your curiosity that you referenced at the end about, you know, the values you were raised with by your dad? And also, how do you resist bitterness? And they might be the same, but I'm curious if you have active practices that you cultivate daily or weekly, or if there's other experiences you seek out for yourself, or in general, how you frame your thinking around those two vectors of living a fulfilling life.
Well, it's all up and down. So there are times when you're elated and you're excited, and then you're also questioning and full of doubt. I think it's just part of human nature. And I think being able to function in both the highs and lows. And I also feel like art is a blessing because it allows you to crawl out of that point when you're low, when you may be not just self-doubting, but also looking at the nature of the world and, you know, the struggle and strife and the privilege of being an artist at this time and moment, and then how I have to be very porous because I have to absorb, but then at the same time, I am very introverted, and I also have to be mindful of my time. So I have to make the art. I make all the art myself. So it's a very difficult place where you get isolated, but you know, you struggle with it. So I don't know what the practice is, but I think it goes up and down. It helps to have to read, to do other things, to force yourself to kind of put yourself in uncomfortable situations, and I think learn. Like for me, learning a different language is really important. Like when I started to create animations, I was like, oh, I need scoring. Who's going to make the score? I wasn't interested in just sampling something, so I had to find a way to come across a composer, establish a relationship with them, put time and energy and effort into that meaningful relationship, learn each other's language, learn the language of how composition works, what are they doing, and then hopefully let that evolve into a collaborative practice. So I'm very proud of that part of my practice, that almost all my collaborative histories are over a long period of time. Like they are not short-lived. It's not like get something done from somebody and move on to the next. It's like an investment in time and relationships. So I think in such relationships can support you, and so definitely being able to I think learn, like when you have to learn something, you have to be vulnerable. Yeah. And vulnerability, I think, is very underrated. Mm-hmm. I think vulnerability is good. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's okay. It's okay to... Sometimes you can't control the narrative. Once you create a work and it exits out of your hand, I saw that, what happened with the sculpture. It's like... It's not within your hands, and you have to come to terms with that also, that art is so much that it has to live outside. And then you're lucky enough that it can create some resonance. Like I was never interested in a benign public art project either. So I was very
no chance of that.
So I was like, okay, how do you kind of, it's a balance of different things. But thank you for that question.
Okay, we have time for one last quick question.
Thank you. So this is more of an observation than a question I was thinking of during the presentation. Oh, I'm right here. Oh, hey. Oh, sure, I can stand. So it's interesting, a lot of your work is about fluidity and meaning being created and being destroyed, and like liminal spaces and all of that. And you've spoken about resisting, like being straitjacketed into like very easy narratives of like East versus West. But then like history is not actually like that. And it's interesting because, you know, like working in America, there's this forgotten history of how what was happening in India at the time of the American Revolution directly led to the American Revolution, you know? So it's like these like mixed histories that we forget or aren't widely known or are erased. So it's like this circle of the stuff that you teach in your work that actually exists in the world, and then you're actively resisting those forces as well as the artist. So that was just an observation.
Yeah, I would say that for me, art is about reacting to confinement, whatever those borders, boundaries, confinement, boxing, descriptions, framing, actual physical labor in the work. Like at some point, it's human nature to to react to whatever is confining you in your time and space, in your age, in the context of that growth. I think like that tension allows progression and growth. And you know, it's all subjective. So as it is, like every 10, like nothing's really original. So even if I am looking at historical paintings, there are other artists that have done that. There's so much more art that probably we don't even know. It never, you know, artists making art in the post-war. We only often hear about Western artists. There's modernisms were happening elsewhere as well. So it's and now it's hyper documentation of every single second and moment of art making. So there is always this idea of like what retains attention and what exits. It's you have to live with it. Like I think all artists struggle with this idea of legacy. Or as you were asking earlier, like I really do wish I had written journals, or I wish I was a writer, because oftentimes I think that writers have this capacity to express detail. And somehow I've always argued with my writer friends that there's more longevity. Or maybe the book is more accessible, or maybe the text is less expensive. And art ends up in somebody's collection, and then it's at their discretion to lend it or share it. So there's always this struggle of what has more longevity.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you again, Shahzia.
What a really fantastic day. I want to thank everyone for being here and for all the wonderful questions, which did take us a little longer than we usually take with the program. So I do need to ask for your help. We have to clear the building in about 10 minutes. So I encourage you to make your way out through the lobby. You know, not in a rush, but it is unfortunately not time for a lot of lingering. So thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful night, and we hope to see you again soon.